18 months old while the polio vaccine was in early phases of distribution across South Dakota. Mark contracted polio. He has been an inspiration to people across the country and in our state while advocating for people with disabilities and working to help eradicate polio worldwide. He even recently awarded the Governor's Award for, I believe it was awarded, for the 2021 South Dakota Outstanding Individual with a Disability for all of his amazing advocacy. Please join me in welcoming our presenter today, Mr. Mark Sternhagen. I'm sorry. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
As was stated, I had polio as a child, and a little bit about polio. You have a little bit of introductory there. Polio has been around for a very long time, and I think there's so much today that kind of correlates to the polio epidemics and things like that. So it's really timely and important to talk about right now. Polio has been around for a long time. It was described in Greek literature in about 500 BC, and so it's been around for a very long time. And some of the things that we think about right now is, there's this talk of natural herd immunity. And I find that interesting because natural herd immunity had 2,500 years to stop polio, and it never did. In fact, it just kept getting worse. And so, that's something that comes to mind all the time here. I do want, as I go through and talk today, if you can think about this from a personal perspective, kind of a what if it was me? And it's not just about polio, it's about being disabled in any form. And some of you are already feeling that. Everybody gets to a point where you're disabled in one way or another. And it kind of is just a natural thing that happens. So as I talk today, I want you to kind of think about it from that perspective. What if it was me? Anyway, back to polio. As stated, it affects the nervous system or your nerves, but only the motor neurons. Those are the ones that transmit the impulses, the electrical impulses from your brain or your stem cell, or your spinal cord, to make your muscles do things. So, when you say move when your brain tells your finger to move, this is the wires that send that signal for your fingers to move. And oddly enough, polio just affects those. It doesn't really affect the receptor neurons, those that bring the information back. So it's like, for example, in my case, and as far as I know, most polio survivors have full sensation throughout their body. So it doesn't really affect that, which I kind of find is a little bit interesting and maybe odd, but that's how viruses are. Polio epidemics were really kind of, they kept getting worse and worse over time. And a lot of that had to do with some things that kind of interestingly, good sanitation actually is part of what allowed polio to really move on, get strong, and become something. And, but it was more the mass transportation. Sorry, I kind of got a frog in my throat today. Mass transportation, people were moving around, and back in the late 1800s when the epidemics really started happening. And when polio would come to a town, it would affect masses of people. It very, it spread very easily. But it had some things that were kind of nice about it in a way, I guess. It's a summer virus. Polio season was from about the end of May through maybe early October. And a year like this year would have been actually very awful for polio. Polio really likes the hot, muggy, warm kind of weather like we had this year. So the polio season probably would just now be ending if it was still with us. By the time Jonas Salk started working on his vaccine in the early 1950s, and he started his real work about 1952, there were some 185 variants spread across 3 different types. In 1954, his vaccine was ready for testing. And it's important to know, first off, I should ask, how many of you have heard of Jonas Salk before I spoke today? Well, that's good, because very often I will speak to groups and maybe 1 or 2 will actually have heard of them. And I think Jonas Salk is a real, maybe in some ways unsung hero. There's a lot of things about his research with the polio vaccine that is very relevant to today. Because his vaccine is a killed virus vaccine. It was one of the first that actually proved, and that was one of his goals, was to prove that a killed virus vaccine could be effective. We knew it would be safe, it wouldn't give you polio, because there is no active live virus in the Salk vaccine. So it's safe, but would it be effective? It turned out that in the long run, it is far better, safer, and more effective, certainly safer, but more effective than even a natural infection like I had. With better long-term protection. The groundwork that Jonas Salk laid is kind of what led to our current vaccines that we're talking about, that's out in the news and talking about today. That basic idea that you didn't have to have live virus in a vaccine for it to be effective. And so it's very removed from that, but the groundwork started with Jonas Salk. Another thing, we talk about how quickly vaccines can be developed. Jonas Salk started really his serious work on the vaccine in about 1952. They started testing, the mass testing was done in 1954. And the summer of 1954, they finished it up right about now in 1954. And it took them until April 12th, 1955, to get all the data collated and look at it and be able to prove that, in fact, the vaccine was effective. And if you look at why it took so long, probably all the computers in the world at the time put together had less computing power than your phone. So to things that we today will push a button and have an instant answer, took months to get that information and to know where, and to double check everything and make sure it was correct. As I said, the Salk vaccine was certified safe by what was the CDC and the FDA at the time in April 12, 1955. I was born in 1956, and as was mentioned, I'm from Scotland, South Dakota, and just kind of down the road a bit from Vermillion. I always say it's not the middle of nowhere, but you can kind of see it from there. And so Scotland was not a high priority area, and the vaccine was in short supply. So when it did come to Scotland in December of 1956, and I was like 9 months old at the time, I didn't get vaccinated because I happened to be running a temp. Now, it's probably I was teething or whatever, little kids who run temps, it's just how it is. But the protocol at the time was, they're running a temp, we don't vaccinate. What we know today about the Salk vaccine would say it would have been safe. But they didn't know that at the time. So that next summer, during polio season, on August 7th, 1957, I got polio. No one else around me that had been vaccinated yet. My siblings, and polio was kind of virus that it would affect everybody that was connected at all, because it was very, very contagious. None of them got it. They'd all been vaccinated. They weren't running a temp that day. But I got it. Now, one thing that I am pretty confident of, had I been vaccinated for polio, I would not have gotten polio. I would not be here talking about it today. I wouldn't have written a couple books about it. I would not have gotten polio. And I think that that's a very important takeaway to what's going on today. And even there were breakthrough cases of with the Salk vaccine, but pretty much none of them ended up with any kind of long-term disability or any disability at all. People if they did get a breakthrough case, it was more like a mild case of the flu, and that's all there was. So anyway, I ended up getting polio. I spent a year in the hospital, first over at Sacred Heart over in Yankton, and then most of the time down in a polio ward in Omaha. I spent some time in an iron lung, and if you don't know what that is, I always picture the bulk milk trucks, the shiny stainless steel milk trucks going down the interstate. That always made me think of the iron lung, because it's kind of where the cab is where the head would be sticking out. And as I said, I spent some time in one. I don't have any memory of that. I do have memory of seeing people in them. By the way, I just saw it just yesterday, the story from a year ago. There is still something like at least 3 people in the United States that are still living in iron lungs since the 1950s. Just think about that. Kind of the ventilator of the day. I do remember seeing people in iron lungs in the polio ward, and when I would go back for surgery or they had extended checkups once a year or something like that. And I had always asked, where was some friend of mine who had been in an iron lung? And I remember at least one specifically, they said, well, he went home. And I thought that was very odd. I'm a little child, and I'm thinking, wow, he went home in that big iron thing. That would be kind of interesting. Well, as it turns out, I learned a couple of years ago that was a euphemism that they used for he died. And that's the other thing about polio that often isn't talked about. People died from polio. There's a classic over in Wisconsin, I believe it is. There was a farm family where the first child woke up on Monday morning, had chills and fever and very weak and couldn't get out of bed, was dead by 5 o'clock that afternoon. By the end of the week, 6 out of the 8 children were dead from polio. So it really was a very serious, dangerous thing. So I ended up starting public school in Scotland. Now, and I should say, back when polio was at its worst, I was completely paralyzed. I could move my head just a little bit, and I could move my right wrist just enough to wave bye-bye to my mom, and that was it. Now, obviously, I did get better. I ended up, if you check out my book, Normal for Me, that's my picture on the cover, and I'm wearing this full-length brace that starts at my chest and full leg braces and stuff. I could walk about 5 steps in that contraption before I had to rest. By the time I started public school, though, I was down to a single leg brace on my left leg, and the forearm were often called military-type aluminum crutches. And I could take care of myself. I got along pretty good. I could do steps. I didn't really like steps, but I could do it. And, when we talk about things like bullies and stuff, it wasn't really so much the other children. Obviously I was picked last for any physical type games or anything that we played, but that's kind of a given. But it really was more adults around me. And, some of them that were directly connected, like my grandmother, that lived in Scotland, and she, her house had these perfect hardwood floors. And she made me sit on a rug whenever I played games with the other kids and my cousins and my siblings and stuff. And if I got even a little bit off of the rug, she'd be snapping her fingers at me. And one of the things to take away from that is it isn't the perception or what the person is intending, but the perception of, in this case, a small child. And I really felt like my grandmother hated me. Now, I don't think that she did, and I don't think she was even trying to be mean, but as a little kid, that's what I saw it as. When I started school in the public schools, and kindergarten, first grade went pretty good. Second grade, there was an older teacher who did not like having me in her class, and I knew that. One of the mistakes that people often make about disabled people is that if they're physically disabled, they're disabled in other ways. And that isn't always true. And in fact, some things like body language and basic instincts are closer to the surface, and we're more aware of things. Now, certainly, body language and stuff, I am, and part of the reason that I know that I am is because I spent so much of my life observing rather than participating in things. I knew she didn't like me, that she didn't want me in her class. I never really understood it because I took care of myself. She didn't have to really do anything much special for me at all, any more than any other child. But she didn't like me having me in her class. I had the bad luck that she had a student teacher that she managed to pass along her prejudices to, and that they hired the next year to teach third grade. Third grade happened to be on the second floor. And I was always pretty cognizant of my disability and being disabled. And I never wanted to be in the way or be a problem or anything like that. So there was a rule that there was no passing on the steps. And so I would always try to either get up early from lunch or recess and stuff, or wait till the other children had gone up and then go up after. Well, one time I got caught halfway at the steps when the bell rang. And so there's this line of children behind me, and they're all trying to get me to hurry up. And of course, I have two speeds when I walk, slow and really slow. And steps going up, and for sure, is really slow. So I'm going up the steps, doing the best I can, and we get to the landing, and one of the kids goes running around me, and I grabbed him and threw him against the wall. Well, then he went running up, and he told the teacher that I threw him against the wall and stuff, and I got lucky in a way because my teacher wasn't back from lunch yet, but the fourth grade teacher was. Now, the fourth grade teacher had known me most of my life, and had actually babysat for us and things like that. She came and asked, Frank said you threw him against the wall. Did you throw him against the wall? Yes, I did. Why did you do that? Well, he passed me on the steps. There's no passing on the steps. So she had us both go in our classroom and wait till our teacher got there, and I could hear them out in the hall talking about it. Anyway, long story short, I had to stay in the next couple of weeks, and he didn't. Another thing that had started to happen was I wasn't getting my homework done. And, again, back to the perception of somebody being disabled, that if they're physically disabled, they're disabled in other ways. And, maybe that was starting to seem like it was maybe true. Because I wasn't getting my homework done, and particularly math, which actually is something I kind of like. But third grade is when you get into things like long division and things like that take time, a lot of paperwork, and the assignments just take a while. I wasn't able to get them finished in class time, and carrying a book walking on crutches is not an easy thing. There weren't like book bags and things like that like we have nowadays. You just carried your books. And I couldn't do it very well. The reason I wasn't getting my homework done was because I couldn't carry my books home. But when they asked me, why aren't you getting your homework done, I just did the typical child response, I don't know. I mean, I knew very well, but there was no way I was going to say, I'm not getting it done because I can't carry my books. That wasn't going to happen. I'd rather be known as stupid than be thought of as this kid that couldn't carry his own books. I know that doesn't seem to make sense, but again, from a child's perspective, it did. And the other thing, some things, for example, my dad had a gas station in town, and we lived about 3 blocks away from it. And one day my little brother John and I were walking home from the gas station. I call him my little brother, but he's about 6'2" and I'm 5'6", but he's a year younger than me, so he's my little brother. Anyway, we're walking and he keeps kicking me in the butt, telling me to hurry up. And as I said, I had 2 speeds, slow and really slow. And he wasn't helping any, and he kept doing it, and I kept telling him to knock it off. And finally, I got upset with him, and I swung my clutch around, and probably lucky that I didn't connect with John, because I connected with a tree, and I broke my clutch off just below the handle. So some of the things like that were starting to happen kind of made it be that maybe Scotland School wasn't a good fit for me. So I ended up going to Sioux Falls to Crippled Children's Hospital and School, and you may be, I'm sure some of you have heard of that. Was developed originally specifically for polio survivors like me to give education and therapy and to provide a place to be. I have to say that, I always say I hated every minute that I was there, and I kind of did, but, there were some good times too. I won't say that there weren't. But the fact is, I didn't hate it so much being there as the fact that I had to be there. That I had to be that little crippled kid that had to go to a special school, that I couldn't be home with my brothers and going to school there and my friends and just being a regular kid. But being at Crippled Children's really had some significant advantages. For one, I could be around a true peer group. People that were like me, that were crippled, that were disabled, like me. Not at the same time, there were polio survivors, and of all the polio survivors I've met, I have never met 2 that had the exact same symptoms. But there were cerebral palsy and spinal bifida and brain injuries and all kinds of things. Being around that true peer group really had some significant advantages. You could push each other to do things. You could say things to each other that you wouldn't normally maybe say. You know how kids can be, things like, maybe watching TV and your friend goes to get a pop, and you say, "Get me one while you're up." And they would say something back to you like, "Get it yourself. What are you, crippled?" The thing is, it was okay, because you both were. Now, it wasn't a very kind thing to say, and it certainly wouldn't have been a very kind thing for someone else to say. The only other ones that maybe would say something like that to me were my brothers, and if they did so, they made sure they were well out of crutch range. But there were things like that you could do. One of the things that a friend of mine had a carbon monoxide poisoning, which is kind of like a stroke, and he was a year or so younger than me. And when he first came there, and the affection to him, how it affected him was, he couldn't really use his right arm, and he could walk, but he drug his left leg, and he had some brain injuries, so he had speech impediments, and it was kind of bad when he was first there, but it got better over time, like brain injuries tend to do. And one of the things with Keith is he would always try to get somebody to button his shirt for him. And because he only, he'd say, "Button it yourself," and he'd say, "one hand," because he could only use one hand to button it. So, being the ornery kind of cuss that I am, I taught myself to button my shirt with just my left hand. So the next time when Keith said one hand, I said, "Yeah, I see what you mean," and I proceeded to button my shirt with just my left hand. Now, Keith wasn't too happy about that, but what it did was it drove him to go to OT that day and get them to teach him to button his shirt with just one hand. And always after that, he buttoned his own shirt. Those are the kind of things that you could do there that maybe you wouldn't be able to do in another environment. It really drove me to independence. And I really, looking back at it, is probably one of the best things that ever happened to me. And I don't really want to even know how my life would have been had I not gone there. I ended up graduating from there in 1973. And one of the things at Crippled Children's was that it was a K-12 school, but it was flexible. When I was in 5th grade, I tested fairly highly on the Iowa Basics. Maybe a lot of you remember those, the old standardized test, Iowa Basic Skills test. And I tested fairly high on those. So they had me skip 6th grade, which was kind of cool in a way, but maybe not in some ways. But one of the things was that when I graduated in 1973, by the way, at the same time my brother Jim, who was a year older than me, graduated, so he wasn't very happy about that. But in any case, I graduated in 1973, and I was full on 17, not 17, almost 18, but very much 17. At that time in South Dakota, the drinking age for 3-2 beer was 18. Well, I started college at the University of South Dakota over at Springfield, before it was a prison. And back at that time, they didn't really card people all that much. If you were going to college and had a college ID, that was good enough. And I guess will say that had I found the classroom as often as I found the bar, I probably would have done fairly well. But I didn't. I was somewhat immature, admit that. And I thought it was really cool that I could drink and nobody knew that I was only 17, and so I did. After a couple years of that, I left kind of by mutual agreement in my 1.4 GPA. Went out to conquer the world. Now, I was in electronics technology, and I'd done fairly well in my electronics class. I was above average in most of them, and I was at least as good in electronics as the next person. Well, I found when I went to look for a job and I was just as good as the next person, and guess what? They hired the next person. You can have all the laws you want about access and about equal rights and all that, but the bottom line is that's the reality of the real world is they're going to hire the next person. Well, after a couple years of that, I went back to the University of South Dakota at Springfield, again before it was a prison. As it turned out, just before it was a prison. And I went back determined to do well. I was determined to put my best effort forward, and I did that. I didn't miss any classes. I studied super hard. I was at or near the top of every one of my classes. And then the governor at the time, later convicted felon, decided that we needed more prisons than we needed educational facilities, higher ed facilities. And so when they closed it down, it was kind of an interesting thing because I had worked at the college radio station over there at KSDI, and I learned a lot about politics, the ins and outs, the kind of unseemly underbelly of it all. Anyway, I ended up transferring to USD over in Vermillion. I spent a year in Vermillion. I actually lived right across the street from the hospital. And I did really well there, but the bad thing was I was dual major at Springfield, electronics technology and PTTE, vocational technical teacher education. And it took them a while to decide what to do, but they moved one of my programs, ET, to SDSU, and the other one, VTTE, to Dakota State. Had I stayed at USD, I had something like 150 credits, but they were all electives, and because USD didn't have the programs. So anyway, I ended up going to Dakota State and SDSU for a year. I graduated on Saturday with a bachelor's in electronics from SDSU, and on Sunday with a bachelor's in education from Dakota State. I earned a master's degree in industrial management from SDSU, and I taught there full-time for 28 years, and then the last few years, part-time online classes really only, for a total of 33 years. When I was at Crippled Children's, I remember one time on probably a Friday, I could smell deep-fried shrimp cooking. And I thought, oh, we're getting a treat for lunch today. Well, we get to lunch and we had something like a god-awful tuna casserole, and I'm like, what happened to the shrimp? I know I smelled that. And someone said, oh, that was the board of directors. They're meeting today, they're getting the shrimp. Always after that, I thought of them as the shrimp eaters. Well, a few years ago, I happened to be up at Fargo with my cousin Mary, who lives in Sisseton, and we'd gone to Red Lobster up in Fargo. And after I dropped her off in Sisseton and I'm driving back to Brookings here, I got to thinking, well, today I was a shrimp eater. And then I thought about it, and I'm like, you know what? Why can't I be? In other words, why couldn't I be on the board of directors at Crippled Children's, which had, by that time, had become Children's Care Hospital and School. I contacted them, and it turned out it was a perfect timing because they were just merging with South Dakota Achieve to become Lifescape. They asked me to be on the board of directors there, and I went down and toured, and what an experience it was to tour first, and now to be on the board. I consider it a gift. To be able to see it from the other perspective, from the top down. And looking back at the rotten kid that I was when I was there, and I kept thinking, I'm lucky that they didn't lock me in a closet someplace and throw away the key. I was a pretty rotten kid when I was there. But I realize now that they understood that I wasn't lashing out against them, I was lashing out against it. And being on the board since then has been a real gift, and I really have appreciated that. One of the things, you know, my books, the Normal for Me, my autobiography, which the second edition is the one that you want to get, and the website for that is www.normal4me.com. But that actually has a USB connection as well. The first edition, when I first wrote the book, I had a couple goals in mind. One was to make sure it was at least 100 pages because a cousin of mine, actually from Crofton, Nebraska, had written a book, and it was right at 100 pages. So I had to write a book that was longer than this. And I was hoping that it would be something that wasn't too much of a snooze fest. So I didn't want it to be long and boring either. And I self-published, so every page kind of costs money. So I didn't want to make it too long because it would cost me more money. Well, it turned out it went fairly well. And one of the things was someone asked me about pictures, and I said, well, there's no pictures in the book because pictures cost money. But I got thinking about it, and I decided to rewrite it because there were some things I wanted to change and add to and things like that. And then I thought about adding some pictures. Well, I started doing a search, and I did a search, and through Interlibrary, I found that down at USD, there was a pamphlet from Crippled Children's back in 1975 at the library, and I got that through Interlibrary loan. Turned out there were 3 pictures actually of me in it, along with other pictures I could use. And so, which really kind of surprised me. So those are in the new edition. The second edition has a number of pictures with the context. The pamphlet didn't really have context, but I was able to add that to it. And so that's the second edition. And then back a year ago when people were sitting around whining about all the things that they couldn't do, I decided, along with my great niece in Sioux Falls to write a children's book that had been in my mind for a long time, and that became Sandy and Me. So you can also get to that through my website, and it's available on Amazon and stuff. So Sandy is my Cocker Spaniel dog that I had when I was a kid, and it's kind of some stories about growing up, being disabled in a small town, and Sandy is my best friend, and often I felt my own friend. Anyway, it looks like we're kind of out of time here, so thank you so much for having me. If you've got any questions or anything, I can certainly try to answer them for you. But thank you again for having me in this week.
We can hear you.
Yeah, I know there have been certain number of people who have had a bounce back. Did you ever have that occur?
Yes, sort of. But it isn't really what people think that you've got, that the virus has become active or something like that. That isn't what it really is. What it is, as I said, it affects the motor neurons, and it affects all of them to some extent. So polio survivors need to realize that you can't do things like exercise to build strength or to lose weight or anything like that. Because, you know, when we talk about exercising, we always have that, you don't gain anything until you feel the burn. Well, myself as a polio survivor, if I feel the burn, I better stop right now, or I could do permanent damage. And what it does is I can burn out more motor neurons. And that's what really is happening is the neurons that were fatigued or weakened get burned out. So it really isn't that you get a real actual recurrence of it. It's really still the same polio, but it's just lasting effects. And yes, I've gotten to the point where I'm kind of confined to the wheelchair now, and it's partly because of that.
Well, Mark, thank you very much for this once again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
For having me.
Okay. Oops. I left my notes down there, of course. I need to tell you what's next week. Next week is Catherine Price of Arts and Science Strategic Planning. And I was at the Up Next meeting this morning, and she was there and talked